A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. We have a really heavy-hitting topic today that cuts right through the noise of modern headlines. Daniel sent us a great prompt to get the gears turning. He wrote, "The dominance of the radio spectrum is becoming the main battleground over which modern wars are won and lost. Electronic warfare is often confused with cyber warfare, and it is worth looking at how they are actually being used together in contemporary conflict."
Herman Poppleberry here, and man, Daniel is hitting on the absolute pulse of 2026 military doctrine. We are living through a period where if you lose the battle for the spectrum, the physical battle is essentially over before the first kinetic shot is even fired. It's a complete paradigm shift. In the 20th century, you fought for the high ground, the literal hills and mountains. Today, the high ground is the 300 megahertz to 30 gigahertz range.
It is wild to think about. We usually think of war as tanks, drones, and boots on the ground. But what you're saying is that if the invisible waves those things rely on are compromised, they are just expensive paperweights. Think about a modern M1 Abrams tank. It's not just armor and a gun, it's a node in a massive digital network. If you sever that link, that tank is essentially blind and deaf. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which helped us pull together some of the deeper technical research for this one. But Herman, let's start with the confusion Daniel mentioned. People use cyber and electronic warfare interchangeably. Break that down for us. Why aren't they the same thing?
That is the perfect place to start because the distinction is actually quite elegant once you see it. Think of it as a difference between physics and logic. Electronic warfare, or EW, targets the physics of the electromagnetic spectrum. We are talking about radio waves, infrared, radar, and laser. When you jam a signal, you are using raw energy to overpower or deceive a physical wave. You are essentially throwing a bucket of white paint over a masterpiece so no one can see the original image.
Okay, I like that. So EW is the paint bucket. What's cyber?
Cyber warfare, on the other hand, targets the logic of the system. It is about code, data, software, and networks. One is fighting with electrons as carriers of energy, the other is fighting with electrons as carriers of information. If EW is the paint bucket, cyber is someone sneaking into the gallery at night and subtly repainting the subject's face so they look like someone else. Both change what you see, but the method is totally different. One is a brute force energy play. The other is a sophisticated data play.
Okay, so EW is the brute force, or the sleight of hand, at the signal level, and cyber is the hacker sitting at a terminal trying to find a backdoor in the software. But Daniel specifically asked how they are used together. In modern military terms, they call this CEMA, right? Cyber electromagnetic activities. How do those two worlds actually shake hands on the battlefield?
Well, I should say that is the formal doctrine. The convergence happens because the spectrum is the truck, and the cyber exploit is the payload. In the past, if a military system was air-gapped, meaning it wasn't connected to the internet, it was considered safe from a cyber attack. You'd need a spy with a thumb drive to get in. But in 2026, the air gap is essentially a myth. If a device has an antenna or even just a circuit board that can pick up radio frequency interference, EW provides the bridge for a cyber attack to cross that gap.
That is a terrifying thought. You don't need a USB stick or a phishing email if you can literally beam the virus into the hardware via a radar dish or radio receiver. It makes me think of those Russian pilots in Ukraine. There have been reports that their cockpit displays are just turning into static or snow because of Ukrainian jamming. Is that EW or cyber?
That is a classic EW move. Electronic attack. You are flooding the radar's frequency with so much noise that the receiver can't distinguish the actual return signal from the junk. It's like trying to hear a friend whisper at a heavy metal concert. But where it gets cyber is when you move from jamming to spoofing. If I just jam you, you know you're being jammed. Your screen goes white, the pilot gets an alert, and they know they are under attack.
Right, it's obvious. But what about the sneaky version?
That's the cyber EW hybrid. If I use EW to intercept your signal, and then use a cyber payload to feed your system false data that looks real, I can make you think there are 50 planes in the sky when there are none. Or worse, I can make your GPS tell you that you are 10 miles west of where you actually are. The system thinks it's working perfectly, but the information it's processing is a lie. This is what we call deceptive electronic warfare. It's not about blocking the signal, it's about hijacking the narrative of the data.
And that is where the EAD-18G Growler comes in, right? We've looked at that bird before, but the tech inside it has evolved so fast. It isn't just a loud noisemaker anymore. I've heard it described as a flying supercomputer that happens to have wings.
No, the Growler is a masterpiece of this convergence. It uses something called digital radio frequency memory, or DRFM. This is the aha moment for anyone trying to understand modern EW. Traditional jamming was like screaming at the top of your lungs so the other person couldn't hear a whisper. It was messy and used a lot of power. DRFM is more like a digital parrot.
A digital parrot? How does that work in practice?
It's brilliant. The Growler captures the enemy's radar pulse, digitizes it in real time, modifies it slightly in the computer, the cyber part, and then retransmits it back to the enemy. To their radar, it looks like a legitimate reflection because it has the exact same signature. But because the Growler has tweaked the timing or the phase, the enemy radar sees the plane in a different location or moving at a different speed. It's essentially editing the enemy's reality as it happens.
So it's a digital hallucination. You're not just blocking their vision, you're rewriting their reality. Now, Daniel mentioned the Ukraine case study, and it's pretty staggering. Russia is reportedly placing EW systems like the JITEL every 10 kilometers along the front. That is a massive density. What does that do to the average soldier on the ground? Does it just kill their cell phone signal? Or is it deeper?
It reverts them to the Stone Age corn. We have seen units forced to use wind-up field telephones from World War I because their encrypted tactical radios are being intercepted or jammed. Imagine trying to coordinate a multinational drone strike when you can't even send a text message to the guy in the next trench. But the real second-order effect Daniel touched on is the GPS-guided munitions. Think about the HIMARS or the JDAM bombs. These are the smart weapons that have defined Western military superiority for decades.
Right. We rely on them because they are surgical. We don't have to carpet bomb a city. We can hit one specific window.
But if you can jam the GPS signal, which is actually a very weak signal coming from space, about as powerful as a refrigerator light bulb seen from a mile away, those billion-dollar weapons become dumb, bombs again. They miss their targets by hundreds of meters. In Ukraine, we've seen the effectiveness of some US-made precision shells drop from 90% to below 10% because of Russian GPS jamming. That is a massive strategic shift. If the smart stuff doesn't work, you're back to who has the most artillery shells and the most bodies to throw into the meat grinder.
It's the ultimate equalizer. You don't need a better missile if you can just make the enemy's missile forget where it's going. But let's look at the cyber side of that bridge. You mentioned RF injection. How does a radio wave actually turn into a line of code inside a computer? I think most people think of code as something you type, not something that travels through the air as a wave.
This is where it gets really nerdy and cool. Every radio receiver has a front end that processes incoming signals. It has to translate that wave into digital bits. If I know the specific protocol your system uses, say a specific version of a wireless mesh network protocol, I can craft a radio signal that isn't just noise. It's a series of pulses that the receiver interprets as a command.
So it's like a voice command for a computer that doesn't have a microphone.
Precisely. It's like shouting in a language the computer understands. I can trigger a buffer overflow in the radio's firmware just by sending a specifically crafted electromagnetic wave. Once that buffer overflows, I have execution rights on the processor. I'm in. I have jumped the air gap without ever touching a keyboard on your network. I can now tell your radio to shut down, Or better yet, to start recording everything it hears and transmit it back to me on a different frequency.
That sounds like magic, but it's just very high-speed physics. I remember reading about Operation Orchard back in 2007. This was when Israeli jets took out a Syrian nuclear facility. The story goes that they didn't just jam the radars, they used a system called Suitor to actually get inside the Syrian network and tell the radar software to simply ignore the incoming Israeli planes. Is that the gold standard for this kind of integrated attack?
It is the foundational example. Instead of blinding the operator with noise, which tells them, hey, someone is attacking us, you gaslight the software. The radar sees the planes, but the software filter, which has been compromised via RF injection, says, oh, that's just a flock of birds, or that's just empty sky. The operator sees a perfectly clear, safe screen while the bombs are literally falling. It's the difference between a smoke screen and an invisibility cloak.
That is the ultimate goal of CEMA. Total dominance without the enemy even knowing they've lost. But Herman, we hold a pretty pro-security, pro-strength worldview here. If we are so dependent on these networks, Project Overmatch, the Navy's plan to link every sensor to every shooter, aren't we building a massive Achilles heel? We are making ourselves the most connected military, which also makes us the most injectable military.
You hit the nail on the head. Our greatest strength is our networking, which makes us incredibly efficient, but it also creates a single point of failure. If an adversary can successfully execute a wide area EW attack that disrupts the timing signals of a network, the whole thing desynchronizes. In 2026, our systems rely on nanosecond level timing from GPS to keep encrypted communications in sync. If you lose that clock, the radios can't talk to each other because they don't know when to hop to the next frequency. The mesh falls apart. It's like a symphony where the conductor suddenly disappears and every musician starts playing at a different tempo.
And this isn't just a military problem. Daniel mentioned civilian vulnerability. Think about a smart city. Everything from traffic lights to the power grid to hospital equipment is increasingly running on 5G or IoT mesh networks. If a military-grade EW platform like a Borisogledska 2 was fired up in the middle of a major city, what happens to the civilian infrastructure?
It's a total collapse of the wireless heartbeat. We saw a small taste of this in the Baltic states recently, with significant GPS interference affecting commercial flights. Pilots were having to revert to old-school ground-based navigation. But if you go after the industrial control systems, the SCADA systems that manage water and electricity, which are increasingly being monitored via wireless sensors to save on cabling costs, you could shut down a city without firing a single bullet.
Wait, so a hacker wouldn't even need to find a vulnerability in the city's firewall?
This is why the distinction Daniel asked about is so vital. A cyber attack on a power grid might be blocked by a firewall, but an EW attack that jams the sensors making the grid think it's overheating could trigger an automatic shutdown that no firewall can stop. The software is doing exactly what it was programmed to do, shut down during an overheat. It just doesn't realize the overheat. Signal is a fake electromagnetic injection.
I want to talk about AI's role in this because you mentioned cognitive EW. In the old days, jamming was dumb. You just broadcast on a frequency. Then the enemy started frequency hopping, jumping around to different channels to avoid the jammer. But AI is changing that game, isn't it? It's not just a human turning a dial anymore.
It's a literal arms race of algorithms. Cognitive EW uses machine learning to sense the environment. It doesn't just jam, it listens. It identifies the enemy's hopping pattern in milliseconds, faster than a human could ever react, and it predicts where the next hop will be. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole, where the hammer knows where the mole is going to pop up before the mole does. The AI can actually learn the fingerprint of a specific enemy radio and follow it across the entire spectrum.
And on the flip side, AI is helping drones overcome EW. If I'm a drone pilot and my link is jammed, the drone usually either hovers or crashes. But with onboard AI for edge computing, the drone can say, okay, I've lost my mom, but I know what a tank looks like, and I know where I am based on visual navigation. Jamming the radio link becomes irrelevant if the brain is inside the drone.
That is the shift from remote piloted to autonomous, and that leads us to a really interesting procurement problem. For the last 20 years, we've been buying platforms, the F-35, the Abrams tank, the carrier. But in this new era of CEMA, the platform matters less than the software-defined capabilities of its sensors. We need to be buying spectrum agility. If your billion-dollar jet has a fixed-frequency radar, it's a liability, not an asset.
It's a different kind of arms race. It's not about who has the biggest gun. It's about who has the most adaptable code and the most resilient antennas. I'm thinking about the 20,000 job gap Daniel mentioned. We have tons of kids wanting to be cybersecurity experts because it sounds cool and pays well. But how many are going into electromagnetic spectrum operations? It sounds like a niche field, but it's actually the front line.
It's the most important job no one has heard of. If you understand the physics of the spectrum and the logic of the code, you are the most valuable person in the room. We are seeing NATO scramble to catch up. In 2024, they established the Joint Cyber and Electronic Warfare Command. They realized they couldn't have the radio guys in one tent and the computer guys in another. They have to be the same people. You need electronic warfare officers who can also write Python scripts and cyber warriors who understand wave propagation and antenna gain.
Let's talk about some practical takeaways for the folks listening who might be in these industries, defense, aerospace, or even just high-level tech. If the air gap is dead, how do you actually harden a system in 2026? What does defense in depth look like when the attack is coming through the walls as a radio wave?
First, you have to audit your RF attack surface. Most companies look at their Ethernet ports and their Wi-Fi passwords. They don't look at the proprietary radio links used by their warehouse robots or their backup power systems. You need to assume that any radio receiver is a potential entry point for malicious code. You need hardware-level filters that can detect non-standard signal structures. Second, we need to move toward decentralized timing.
You mean stop relying on the satellites?
We are way too dependent on GPS for our system clocks. We need local, high-precision atomic clocks, chip-scale atomic clocks, on every major piece of infrastructure so they can flywheel for days or weeks even if the GPS is jammed. If your system can keep perfect time internally, it's much harder for an attacker to desynchronize your network.
That makes total sense. Don't rely on the voice from the sky for your time. Keep your own watch. And for the average person, it's worth realizing that when your phone loses signal or your GPS starts acting wonky, it might not just be a dead zone. In a world of increasing geopolitical tension, the spectrum is the first place that friction shows up. It's the canary in the coal mine for modern conflict.
We're seeing gray zone warfare every day now. Russian jammers in the Kaliningrad area are regularly affecting civilian aviation in Poland and Sweden. It's a way of projecting power and causing disruption without actually crossing the threshold of conventional war. It's invisible. Harassment. They aren't shooting at planes, but they are making it dangerous for those planes to fly. How do you respond to that? It's not an act of war in the traditional sense, but it's certainly an act of aggression.
It's the ultimate deniable weapon. Oh, we weren't jamming you. There must just be some solar flares or atmospheric interference. It's hard to prove, hard to stop, and incredibly effective. It creates a sense of instability and lack of control.
And that brings us back to Daniel's core point. The spectrum is the maneuver space. If you can't navigate it, you can't move in the real world. We saw this in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in 2020, which was really a preview of this. Azerbaijan used Turkish and Israeli EW systems to essentially turn off the Armenian air defenses. They didn't have to destroy every radar, they just had to make them useless for a few critical hours. Once the eyes were off, the drones could move in at will.
It's like a digital fog of war that you can turn on and off with a switch. So, looking forward, where does this go? If AI is the brain, and EW is the truck, and cyber is the payload, what is the next step? Is it directed energy weapons? Are we moving from messing with signals to melting circuits?
Directed energy lasers and high-powered microwaves is the logical conclusion. If EW is deceiving the signal and cyber is hacking the code, directed energy is frying the hardware. We are seeing the development of HPM, or high-power microwave weapons that can be fitted to drones. They fly over a command center and release a burst of electromagnetic energy that doesn't blow up the building, but it melts every silicon chip inside.
So you leave the building standing, but everyone inside is suddenly living in the year 1850. No computers, no lights, no comms. It's a surgical EMP.
And unlike a nuclear EMP, which is indiscriminate and would take out an entire state, these HPM weapons are surgical. You can target a specific room or a specific vehicle. It's the ultimate convergence of physics and warfare. You aren't just winning the battle for the spectrum, you are physically removing the enemy's ability to even participate in the spectrum.
We've covered a lot of ground here, and I think the big aha moment for me is that we have to stop thinking of the internet and the airwaves as separate things. They are two different views of the same interconnected system. If you're a developer, you're an EW participant whether you like it or not, because your code is going to be transmitted over those waves. If that transmission can be intercepted and the code altered, your software is only as good as the radio link it lives on.
And if you're an EW operator, you're a coder, because you're manipulating the data that those waves carry. The silos are gone. This is why Daniel's prompt was so timely. We are seeing a fundamental shift in how humanity fights, and it's happening in a domain we can't even see with our own eyes. It's a ghost war.
It's a weird thought that the most important battles of the next decade might be won by a few guys in a van with a high-gain antenna and a very clever piece of Python code, rather than a tank division. It changes the whole math of what power looks like on the world stage.
It's already happening. We just don't always see the snow on the screen from where we're sitting. But for the commanders on the ground, that snow is the difference between life and death.
Well, this has been an eye-opener. I think we've really unpacked the CEMA concept and why that bridge between EW and cyber is the most dangerous place to be right now. It's not just about hacking or jamming. It's about the total mastery of the electromagnetic environment. Herman, you've been dying to talk about DRFM for weeks, I could tell.
Guilty as charged. It's just such a beautiful piece of engineering. The idea of a digital parrot that can trick a multi-million-dollar radar system by playing its own voice back to it is just, it's peak nerd. It's the ultimate stop hitting yourself move in military history.
It really is. We should probably wrap this one up before you start explaining the Fourier transform of a jamming signal, and we lose half the audience to a nap.
Hey, I could do it. I could make it interesting. But I'll spare the listeners for today.
Much appreciated. Thanks for the deep dive, Herman. And a huge thanks to Daniel for sending this in. It's a topic that really highlights why we do this show, to look at the weird, invisible layers of the world that most people just take for granted, but that actually run the whole show.
Thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the signals clear on this end and ensuring we don't get jammed mid-broadcast.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. If you want to keep up with these invisible battlefields, you can find us at myweirdprompts.com or follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We've got a lot more coming on the future of tech and security.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We'll see you in the spectrum. Stay agile, stay encrypted.
Take it easy.
Goodbye.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to